Katelyn, everyone is telling us that we should build a personal brand, and it's one of the most important compounding things we can do in our business in order to succeed. But nowadays, everyone is able to create content, and it's not as easy as it used to be to stand out. Why is that happening in the first place, and what's the solution?
I think ultimately having a personal brand has always been an effective, compounding, valuable thing for us as entrepreneurs. And you have a personal brand whether you put effort into it or not. Your personal brand is essentially just what other people think of when they think of you. And the difference between doing it strategically and just hoping that it all kind of pulls together is that when you clarify the message you want to be known for and you're thoughtful in repeating it and it's strategic and aligned with what you want people to think of so that they hire you or buy from you, then it can be very valuable for your business. I think what's changed in the recent years is two big things. For one, everybody kind of got excited about it. It was not something that the average entrepreneur was even thinking about, I'd say 5 years ago. And there were some folks who would come on, recognize that they kind of wanted to be an influencer, but for the most part, the average entrepreneur was not too concerned about it. Now there's been just so much hype around this being a necessity for entrepreneurs. And I don't necessarily think it's a necessity, but I absolutely think that it's one, as the world is changing, it's one of the more significant ways that you can get traction and differentiate yourself, and it's worth doing. So I'm hyped up about it. I think the other thing is that there's more content than ever before because it's easier than it's ever been to create it. And what that means is that everyone who might have wanted to do it in the past, but really was short on time, is suddenly jumping in at full force. But that means our feeds, our social media feeds, our podcast feeds, they're just full of more and more content than ever. And so doing good content is no longer enough to stand out anymore. And you really need you need an edge beyond that. And the way that I see it is that you need an ownable idea. And maybe that will be part of what we discuss today. But personal brands, important, have always been, but with the way that the world is going and with more and more people jumping into entrepreneurship and more people creating content, it's really a great way to build trust with an audience of buyers.
Indeed. And that's the nitty-gritty of the things that we want to discuss today, because sounds flashy, ownable idea. But in the same time, everyone kind of want that, right? Like, we want to be known for something, we want to leave some sort of legacy. But just coming up with a unique idea, it's so freaking hard.
It is, and you know what? It's hard for a number of reasons. And I think that people don't really think. It's the thing that would be revelatory to an audience that you want to get in front of, that's meaningful to your business. The thing that'd be revelatory to them sometimes feels kind of obvious to you because we are stuck in our brains all day long, and we've often worked in our industry, sometimes for decades. And so the things that we see and the way that we see things differently sometimes don't feel that novel or distinctive to us. And so when people go to sit down and they think about their ownable idea, they're really often framing it from a lens of like, what would I is just really compelling? But you're not your audience. You have a lot of details your audience doesn't have. You have a lot of experience and nuances your audience doesn't have. So for one, I think people discount great ideas because they perceive them to be too obvious without realizing where their audience is actually at. And the other thing is that folks are often afraid to question best practices in their industry, to question what people about the ways to do things. And so even if they're quietly working differently than their peers, they might not feel comfortable sharing how they work differently because they're afraid of ridicule. They're afraid of being called out for doing it wrong. And so a big part of making this work for you is having the confidence and kind of like courage to say different, know that it's going to attract potential backlash or questioning from peers, and be able to stand back and kind of like back that different opinion. That's scary for a lot of my clients because fear, if I say this, what will people say? Or could I be ridiculed? And so that's something that a lot of folks don't even allow themselves to think differently because society has kind of encouraged us not to.
Yeah, and especially because when you're being rejected, You're not part of the tribe anymore. And yeah, your business will fail and all those limiting beliefs that we tell ourselves. And the reality is quite different, because if you look around, and I know you have a lot of examples of ownable ideas and people that really stand their ground around it in order to be able to build the audiences and the businesses they have today, like James Clear with Atomic Habits and others. And how do you came out with this approach? And if you can share as well examples of how do you believe, like let's say James Clear or I don't know, Justin Welsh came up with their own ownable ideas in order to stand out and truly defend them rather than just being afraid to share them.
I love this. So the way that I got to this work, to give your audience a bit of context, is I launched a personal branding challenge with my co-founders at Demand Curve back in the end of 2022. And at the time, personal branding was kind of like becoming a bit of a buzz thing. It wasn't nearly what it is now. This is 4 years ago. Of course, it's a much bigger movement now than it was then. But at the end of that challenge, we had an exercise where we had people to kind of summarize all of the work that they'd done up to that point, and we encouraged them to think through what at the time I was calling the big idea. And the big idea is not my term; it's someone that is out there. But it was this idea of a lot of authors and speakers. They're often sharing kind of like a big idea that becomes the central argument for their work, and or that particular work, whether it be a book or a speech or maybe a blog post. But what I saw was that the folks who were having the most success with really massive breakthroughs when it came to audience growth and authority were folks that had become known for this idea that you associated with them. And you mentioned people like James Clear or Justin Welsh. They've done such an incredible job of compacting a argument and their own lived experience and lens on the world into a story that they tell that's incredibly compelling, that invites you in, and they've compressed that into a few really spread, and people came to associate with them. So a lot of people may not realize this if they're big fans of Justin Welsh's, and I'm a big fan of Justin's. He's a great human, but he did not coin the phrase solopreneur. People might think of Justin when they think of the phrase solopreneur because he's done an incredible job of the story around that, creating awareness of that as an option. But he's not the one who coined it. The person who actually originally came up with that term was somebody who went through the Unignorable Challenge, and she coined it years before Justin started using it. What Justin did that was really brilliant, and why we think of Justin when we think of that term now instead of Terry, who's the original person who coined it, is he gave us a narrative and an aspirational identity to step into. So back when I was running my first company, which was a branding agency, at the time when I started, it was just me. But the idea of being a solopreneur wasn't something people aspired to back in 2010. It was actually something that felt a bit shameful. And so people like me would put pictures on their website of their team, and the team was often just like other freelancers or contractors that they might work with, because you didn't want to appear to be small. Being small it almost made it look like your business wasn't serious, that you weren't a serious entrepreneur. And so flash forward to, I think probably it was 2020 or 2021, when I first started seeing Justin's content. I think that he reached out to me when he was about to move on to Twitter, because I'd been building an audience over there and he'd been focused primarily on LinkedIn at the time. And we got to chatting, and the story he was telling around solopreneurship was so compelling to me, because as somebody who had the struggles of building a team and trying to organize those people and making payroll every month, and then going off and building a VC-backed tech company and having a founder, but having the struggle of like not necessarily the right relationship or the right building the right company for that relationship, I thought, how great would it be to not have to deal with all the messy human parts of business and to just be a solopreneur? I can build this like media and education company that's like built around me, and how great would that be? And so he told an incredible story of why it was the time in history where solopreneurship was this untapped opportunity. And he showed his own journey. And of course, Justin's been incredibly successful with selling education products, making a lot of money at them. He talks about getting up in the morning and having a leisurely 2-hour breakfast with his wife. Like, these are the things that people want. And so when people think about an ownable idea, the very kind of like tippity top of the iceberg are the words and the language that we come to associate with somebody. But the thing that makes it travel and the thing that makes it actually revelatory and compelling enough that it is something we want to buy into, it's the underlying story that they're telling. That's the piece that matters. And with James Clear, same idea, like Atomic Habits, brilliant language. He named something that it made it really compelling. It kind of like indicated what it was he was doing. But the story he was telling underneath that, all of us have had the pain of wanting to make a big change in our life and starting strong and like setting big goals and then not seeing ourselves achieve them. And he came with this new lens on that problem, which was that after he was an athlete and he had a career ending, and then he had to rebuild his life, and he wanted to adopt these new habits so that he could build this new life. And he found himself struggling like so many of us do. And he started looking into like, why am I doing all the things people tell you to do around setting goals and achievement and not actually succeeding? And he dug into all of this behavioral data and trying to really understand this. And what he found was that we'd all been doing it wrong. Right? We'd gone out and we'd set these big goals without actually building any systems behind them that actually allowed us to achieve those goals. And so we'd start off strong with this big momentum, but we didn't actually have the right systems in place that allowed us to achieve those. And it was like even 1% improvement each day compounds into a totally different life. This was revelatory when James started talking about it. Now, of course, because he has the best-selling nonfiction business book of all time, his ideas have spread a lot, and it doesn't necessarily feel as revelatory to hear it now. But at the time when he came out with it, game-changing, right? And so it's about not just identifying a few sexy words, because like that's part of it, but it's about understanding what an audience wants, why they've struggled to achieve it, and how you have a different approach to that problem that could change their life, and crafting a story around that.
And based on this, on what you share, isn't the easiest path to do so when your audience is maybe just you a couple of months or years ago? You had a problem, you solve it, you share the story, they resonate with the story, and kind of they want, let's say, the blueprint.
I think that's popular advice in the entrepreneurial space. I would tend to disagree, only because I think it depends on what your business is. So if you're an expert entrepreneur, let's say you're a graphic designer, unless you want to build an audience of graphic designers who will probably never hire you, chances are you don't want to create content for you 3 years ago. Because what a lot of your audience needs to know isn't necessarily it isn't necessarily like how you're running your business or the way that you approach graphic design or kind of like your innermost thinking. What they probably need to know is your audience needs to know, how do you think differently about the work in a way that's going to benefit them? So a great example of this is my friend Sarah Hart. So Sarah Hart's a brilliant designer. She's done a lot of my work over the years, and she went through the Unignorable challenge as well. Like, came out of it, built this great audience that allowed her to become like booked out with her business. But she has this very revelatory approach to how she does design work, and her argument is essentially that if you're a brand today and you want to break through, you want to be the glitch, because so much in graphic design is around trends. And there's this running joke that if you take a bunch of like SaaS companies' websites and you put them up next to each other and you remove the logo, you're gonna have no idea whose is whose. They all look the same, right? And so her thing is be the glitch. And she wrote this incredible post around thinking about a brand, like let's say in the wellness space, right? A massage and wellness studio. Well, typically those all kind of look the same, because when we think about that space, we think like ocean blues and sandy tones and calm. And like, she's like, how do you build something that stands out when everybody is doing the same thing? It's like you could actually use like an electric orange. And she mocked it up, and it was like this sexy, like it was still moody. It had all the elements that you want in in like a wellness brand, but it looked completely different than anything else. So for Sarah, again, she's not saying, here's what I was doing 3 years ago as a graphic designer, follow my journey, here's my thinking. She was having a point of view on her entire industry and how a lot of folks are going about it wrong and how it's actually costing their clients a lot of money because they're not designing to stand out. They're designing to fit the category, which she was saying is the big mistake. So to answer your question, if your audience are people like you 3 years ago, and in my case, some of mine are, then absolutely create content that's going to be relevant to that audience. But if you're not selling to people like you, if you're actually selling to customers who don't want to learn how to be graphic designers, who don't actually necessarily care that much about how you run your business, that want to know, what do you know about design and branding and the approach that actually I'm missing that's going to make my business more successful, then you need to come up with an idea that will attract those people. Does that make sense?
It makes, and let's get a bit tactical here. And I can give you some examples of the things I think through before recording. So for example, I'm in a transition in my business. I ran my business for 15 years, and I went from stages to stages, like freelancer, agency owner, then consulting. And I feel like I need more. I want to have an impact. It's one of the reasons why I run this podcast and so on. And I'm keep on asking myself who to serve and who I can serve best. And looking at my own situation in which I'm a generalist and I hate the word niching down and like being in one box for entire of your life and so on. So I look at that, I look at as well at the situation that I'm in which I feel overwhelmed sometimes when it comes to the options that you have nowadays. It's probably the best time to be alive to run a business with all the opportunities, but in the same time, it's so hard to choose a path. So I dive deep into what I did every single time when I pivot, and I identified 3 pillars that I basically build on. Curiosity, always following my curiosity, adaptability, like trying to find ways to leverage that curiosity, and then the relationship that I built over the years, always like compound over time. And I came with this idea of compounding, like betting on what compounds. And speaking of personal branding or owning an idea, that sounds good to me. Like if you own an idea, it's so easy to compound that over time because you talk about it like thousands of times and eventually will stick to the audience that you want to serve. And in my case, I was thinking like, speaking of the general advice, maybe generalists, people that are struggling to choose a path, people that are like tired of the things that, I don't know, work on for the past 10, 15 years and so on. And I want your thoughts on that, like how sticky that can be in terms of approach and any ways you can even run the framework that you're building through it if you want.
Yeah, for sure. So thank you for sharing all of that context. And I think that a lot of your listeners are probably feeling they feel that similar challenge. And I felt it myself too. I think entrepreneurs tend to be ideas people because if you weren't, you probably wouldn't get into this line of work. And we are also grass is greener people. And I am guilty of this myself, where something might be working to an extent for us, but we don't feel like it's necessarily what we could be, what we're capable of. And so we pivot often too quickly. I've done that often in my entrepreneurial journey. And that leads us to developing a bunch of different skills, learning a bunch of different things, and becoming more generalists. And so I think there's something to the generalist idea. There's a community, I'm blanking on her name right now, but a friend of mine, like, an internet friend who we interact with each other, she runs a community called the Generalists. And it's a community specifically for people who feel that struggle where there's like, I don't want to be in a specific box. I want to build a career where I get to use these different skills. I don't want to be boxed in. And she's been super successful with it. Like, she's speaking all over the world. She's built a job board for companies that recognize that they want to hire generalists. As a small business, I want to hire generalists because oftentimes you can't bring in somebody who's super specialized because you don't have enough super specialized work for one full-time role. You need somebody who can get their hands in all sorts of stuff. So I'd say the way that I would start working through this with you would be asking yourself, like, ultimately, who might you want to serve as whether it's a client or a buyer of a product that you're building. And we need to think about what they want, because ultimately that's going to help us shape the generalist arc in a way that they're going to be attracted to it. And what Millie did with her approach is like there's a lot of people like us who have that fear of not wanting to do one very narrow thing. We get bored very easily. And it's like, okay, so if that's the case, then what do those people want? What's their problem? And then how do you come up with a lens and kind of like a revelatory approach to solving that? And I'd look at what Millie's doing with her community. I'd say that part of what she's helping them to do is she's advocating for the generalist as an identity, and then also connecting with a larger audience to show why do you want to work with generalists? Why would you want to hire the generalist freelancer or hire the full-timer who doesn't actually have the typical resume, but they actually are going to bring a lot of value? So that's part of how I think these people existed, and they wanted a place to connect with others like them, and they wanted to get paid well for the work they're doing, whether that's working in-house or building their own business. But they needed a better way to pitch why being a generalist is a good thing. And that's part of what she's helping to do. She's helping to shape that narrative.
Nice. And actually, I was doing my research and I found her, and I found as well a podcast, and I think there is another community out there. And I was like, how I see this? Because I don't want, for example, to attract freelancers. I don't want to attract contractors. I would rather attract people that build businesses, because that's what I'm passionate about and what I truly want and my values and so on. And I was looking like, all right, freedom, it's one of them, because for the past 7 years, I was digital nomading and loving the ability to like work when I want, with whom I want, from where I want, and all that. But of course, it's not always easy. But the whole point was to build around freedom, around the fact that I don't want to build a life around my business, but I want to build a business around my life. So something similar to the direction Justin Welsh is going right now. So here, where that leads, it's a lot of people go through this process, right? And they're like, all right, but how my idea is unique? Like, because everyone is doing parts of it, like the example you described, the things that I discovered as well in my research and so on. So how can I truly stand out in this? Personally, I tied it to the word wild. I love systems, so I love structure, but more of untamed. I don't want to be put in a box. So I was came with the idea of like the wild generalist. And I actually used that in my signature for like the past 2 months in order to see if people says something about it or anyone didn't say anything. But the whole point is like, if you can ask, and those listening go through the process of digging deeper into this, how do you truly stand out with your unique idea?
I think the first part is finding what it is, right? And that's the first thing we do with our clients through the unignorable experience is like, there's a lot of like, there's several conversations that are very structured where I'm trying to pull this stuff out of them. And to your point, like, it's hard for you to see this in yourself. We will overthink this stuff. I have clients who, before working with me, spent months having conversations with Claude, trying to figure out what their messaging should be. And we often really struggle to see it for ourselves. So I'd say one piece of it would probably be, can you identify somebody whose judgment you trust, who understands the people that you want to serve or the strategy you want to go after? If it sounds like to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're looking at how do I get clients and make money right now, and also build a platform that's going to allow me more optionality for the future? Is that the truth?
Exactly. So basically, I was even thinking to like build in public, to showcase how I transitioned to like attracting like-minded people, but in the same time still doing the things that I love, so on around business and marketing. So
let me ask you a question, because this kind of matters how you approach it. When it comes to how you get clients, typically, where do clients come from for you?
the third pillar that I mentioned to you, relationships, but it's strategic approach to it. It's not just the traditional word of mouth podcast alone, which now has 160 episodes. I offer something of valuable to each guest. It can be a breakthrough session or something, but not with the intention of pitching, but with the intention of helping, and that pays back in different ways. Either they becoming clients at some point or referring me to someone and so on. So that's practically 50 something percent of the leads.
Perfect. So the reason I ask that is because if you're not reliant on, your personal brand, your social content necessarily as your primary channel for new clients, because you are building relationships, you're using the podcast as a way to generate relationships, you're probably doing outreach and getting connections that way, then you can use your personal brand to build towards the thing you want next, which is to attract like-minded people and to probably eventually build something for them, whether that be a community or software or cohort or something like that. So with that in mind, you don't necessarily need to align the message that you're sharing personally on your social channels or through your email with the message that gets you clients. And the reason that matters is because if you did, the approach is going to be different. But if you don't, then you can go all in on, I want to build an audience of people for this next venture, whatever that might be. And the idea around the wild generalist, like the untamed, I think there's something very attractive there. What I would say is I would find somebody who is you trust their judgment, who is either a really good strategic thinker or who represents your kind of ideal customer who you see as the end user for whatever this new venture might be. And what you'd want to do is have structured conversations and have what is the thinking where you want, it takes time to kind of pull these things out, but what's the thinking where they go, oh wait, stop, that's it. And I think a lot of people jump to this is what I want, this is the kind of the thing I want to be known for. They don't spend enough time thinking about how do I match that to what my market needs to hear? Because to your point, there's a lot of folks there's lots of universal wants and universal problems, right? So a universal want is freedom over our time, is to have financial stability. If you look at a lot of the biggest brands, a lot of them are still selling to that universal want. The Justin Welshes of the world, he's got one path to get financial security and wealth. Then you look at somebody like Cody Sanchez, totally different path to get there, totally different idea that she would be an owner of, but same underlying want, which is freedom, financial stability, feeling like a bit of a rebel. I'd say that both Justin and Cody play into that desire that people have. So the wants are universal, but different people have problems that can sometimes be very narrow. So who might have a problem that the traditional path really doesn't work for them, where you can make an aspirational message to go to that same universal want, where you can go, okay, if I go super narrowly here, then maybe I need to talk to more of those people to figure out what's holding them back. And I think that this is just me spitballing off the top of my head, but the one pain point that somebody who identifies as a wild generalist might have is they pivot too fast and their boredom kicks in quick and they move before they actually see a lot of value, and they don't necessarily trust that their idea is going to work, and so they jump before it really has a chance to land. Maybe there's an opportunity for a community that helps with that, where you actually can get kind of third-party validation on your ideas, where you're working through something with someone so you don't default to the grass is always greener too quickly. Is there a problem there where these people who tend to be generalists they're kind of burning themselves? It's not identifying kind of what that thing is. Usually comes down to seeing what the problem is they're struggling with and then thinking about well, how do I approach this differently? Both Justin and Cody Welsh saw a similar problem, which was all of these super smart, ambitious people are chasing success based on what the world has said that success looks like, whether that's being being a founder of the next unicorn tech company or climbing the corporate ladder into the C-suite and making a lot of money. And a lot of those people that were chasing those things, themselves included, were finding it very hollow, and they were dissatisfied with that path. So they looked at well, if that's not the path to success, if everyone's selling us, go build the next big unicorn company or get, keep working your ass off till you get the C-suite role, what's my take on what success is and what it could look like? And that's where the differentiated view leads to the idea that people can start to buy into. So I'd say like if there's more people wanting to digital nomad, if there's more people that are open to describing themselves as generalists, like where's that coming from? And how might you solve that problem differently?
So based on what you share, I'm thinking through the lenses that you mentioned, like for them to have an aspiration, the audience, right? Then to have a specific problem they want to pay for, and then you share your own lens, then you reveal the truth that maybe they oversee. And I think the fifth was the direction, what exactly you share, and loops back to the aspiration, right? And once you do that, you do all that work, what's next in order to come up with your ownable idea? Because you mentioned there are many types.
Absolutely. There's lots of different types of ownable ideas. Some people would have probably more than one. So the way I look at it is typically there's like a primary one that if you were to say somebody's name, they would go to something. And it could be, in Justin Welsh's case, it could be solopreneur, which is more of an identity. In Cody Sanchez's case, you might think of boring businesses, which is really more of like a category of businesses. And so what I found was there was never a lot of like shape or frameworks put around this. It was kind of this sense of like, yeah, you just like figure out like what your idea is and you go from there. But it's different. The way that you buy into somebody's idea is different than the way you buy a product. And so when it comes to kind of like answering those questions, I find that those questions are useful for me in actually create. What I will do is I'll interview our clients. I'll have them do a couple of different exercises. One that I get them to do is what's called like the rebel point of view exercise, where I get them to look at what are the kind of like default ways of thinking in your industry. So how do people typically solve problems? What do they tend to believe? What's the approach that's normal? What are some of like the cliches? So an example in marketing might be there's this kind of cliche in marketing, which is like sell benefits, not features. And lots of marketers say that. Lots of marketers don't question that because they go, okay, well, that makes sense. Like, yeah, you got to sell the benefits, not the features. And then I remember the first time I saw, I don't know whether it was Anthony or Rob, because I kind of like, they're blended in my mind, but they're the co-founders of Fletch Product Marketing, and they do positioning and messaging, homepage messaging for SaaS companies. And they basically said, that's bullshit. They're like, this leads so many people astray because oftentimes you'll land on a software homepage and you have no idea what it actually does because all they're doing is trying to lead with benefits. And they're like, people come to your page, they have a specific job to be done. They're looking to understand how you're going to help them get that job done. That might mean you want to talk about the features that your product has that differentiates it from other solutions they might be considering. And so that was kind of a revelatory point of view that they had on their industry that they shared that got questions. A lot of times when you're sharing this stuff, you're going to get pushback from people who have always done it that way. And that often goes to show that there's something interesting there. So the 5 questions are ways to kind of like help you to think about it. But what will come out of that should be like an argument. In Anthony and Rob's case, it's like, no, explain what your thing does. Don't just talk about the high level benefits because that's why nobody understands your software. They don't know if it's for them or not, and they bounce off your site. That's a unique perspective that they're bringing, right? That's revelatory. So it's really in like audit your different perspectives and thinking about the way you approach the work you do differently and using that as a jumping off point or what might be something that gives you a strong enough foundation to build on. It's certainly not easy, and I think it's harder when you're in a case where it sounds like it where you are, where you like you said, there's so many endless options, right? There's so many different ways that you could go and approach this because your work tends to be more generalist. It's harder to probably benchmark against the common way of doing things because you're doing a lot of different types of work. So it can be helpful to look at, okay, so if you've kind of narrowed it on this like generalist thing, this idea that there are people who don't want to be put in a box, like what is their typical approach to solving that problem? And then how might you suggest that it gets solved differently? Um, Another person that I think of when I think of the space that you're playing in, I can't remember his name, but he's more in the software world. But for most folks, they think about like you're going to build software, you're going to go off, you're going to raise venture capital, you're going to commit years of your life, hopefully have a life-changing exit. How great would that be? And his approach was totally different. He's like, I'm going to make a whole bunch of different bets. I'm going to launch a whole bunch of different products. I'm going to do it by myself without a team. And it's like, oh, and then he created this kind of movement and this massive following of engineers who are like, that sounds better. That sounds better than having to deal with all the human pains of building software and having to raise venture capital. Just make a bunch of different bets, right? So it was a different approach that was against the status quo around how to build a software company. So I think you need to narrow in on some different problems and aspirations that your target market might have, and then explore your differentiated way of thinking before you jump into kind of the next phase, which is like, okay, like how do I start sharing this thing? How do I shape the words? You really have to get kind of some clarity around what do I truly think that feels different and fresh? And sometimes the best way to do that is to talk through it with somebody else, because oftentimes, again, we don't see our own thinking as necessarily as revelatory and fresh, because to us it just feels pretty common.
Yeah, and that's why it's so powerful to get help, because otherwise it's almost impossible. There is a common saying that you cannot see the label from inside the jar. And yeah, when you're so close to the problem, so close to the what you think is the solution or the perfect naming for your ownable idea or the wording and all that stuff that we mentioned at the beginning, but in reality, you need that outside perspective.
I was just recently on my friend Alex Swift's podcast, and this is a topic that him and I have been chatting about a bit back and forth before we did the podcast. And he came in with an idea for what he thought his ownable idea was. And I'd seen him sharing some other thinking through his newsletter that was kind of like in that same space, but it was something a bit more narrow. And to me, I was like, that's a bigger opportunity for you. Now, Alex is a brilliant strategist. I mean, he's getting hired by companies like Porsche and Microsoft to help them with their strategy. And even somebody as brilliant as Alex, he kind of discounted the power of one of his ideas. And it wasn't until like we sat down and like I was like, this is why I think this is so good. And here's the opportunity here, that he really got excited about that and ended up leaning more in that direction. But even, if an expert strategist that people hire to do their strategy needs help from an outsider too, then what chance do the rest of us have, right?
Yeah, true. And I'm curious here, like when someone comes to you and they maybe have multiple types of ownable ideas, like maybe an identity, others they think they find the holy grail and they build a new category or something. How do you make them choose the right path?
So when they come to me, they haven't thought about the final kind of like compression of it into a thing yet. Like they're usually not there. Where they're at when they come to me is like, all my clients are entrepreneurs. Most of them, but due to the nature of the way that I do the work, are pretty, they're successful in their space. They're known well by their target customers, even if their industry is quite small, but they have ambition beyond what their current business model will allow. And so they recognize the opportunity to build an audience and they want to do that. Now, because many of them are, experienced in their space, have oftentimes been in the space for decades, a lot of different strong points of view on ways to do things differently in their industry. And what they're struggling with is kind of like narrowing in on like, what's the opportunity? And so the way that I approach it is I go in and I start pulling from them. I have a series of questions I ask. I have a way of thinking about it. I have exercises that they do. But what I'm trying to do is I narrow it down to like two different options for what I call the central argument, which is kind of that foundational argument that you make, that you build from. And I help them to take what they want to say, and I go out and I look at, well, what does the market want to hear, right? What's happening in the macro environment? How do your buyers think about this, your space in general? So what do they want to hear? And I help them to put those two things together. Because what often happens is that people want to lead with the message that is sometimes the solution to root problem that's keeping their target customers stuck, but their target customers are only aware of a surface problem. They're not necessarily aware of the root problem, and therefore they're not interested in a solution to a root problem because they don't know they have it. And so a lot of the work that I do is kind of like getting them to pull up a layer, to understand and meet their market where they are, to recognize that the thing that they're really amped about talking about, while interesting, is probably actually the direction that they're going to share with their ownable idea, not the revelatory thing itself. It's okay, this is how you're going to tell them to do the thing. This isn't the revelatory thing. There's a lot of kind of back and forth. There's a lot of like looking at what's out there and what are other peers saying, because that's another piece of it, right? I remember doing a call with one of the clients from the first batch when I was trying to figure out, like, is this a service that we can offer? And I wasn't sure. And I look back at some of those early conversations, and a lot of the things that they were sharing to me as a layperson, not knowing a lot about their industry, seemed pretty revelatory. I was like, oh, that's really cool. That does feel different. And then when I went off and actually did research, I found that there were some people who were basically saying the same thing, and that there's a lot of noise with that same message. It's like, okay, so this isn't the area, this isn't the opportunity. So there's a lot of kind of like turning over rocks, finding what's there, then sense making, going back to the market. I wish that it was a checkbox activity that you can do and just come out with something that's brilliant, but it requires a lot of interaction and engagement with the market, both to see what might be compelling to them and then to put it out in front of them and start evaluating and adjusting and evolving it. So it's not as simple as choose the right words, choose the right, come up with a cool framework. There's a lot more thinking that goes into it than that.
And I love how you tap into the previous work that you did with Why We Buy. Because at the end of the day, it's all buyer psychology here, in which we really need to understand them and to talk to the market. Otherwise, it's so hard to, I just came up with a flash idea like I did with Wild Generalist, but probably won't land because no one will resonate with that. And was like, what the heck is this guy doing? Yeah.
But it might.
might.
And I think that it's about, how do you make that the answer to their problem? That's the piece that I think you really need to flesh out. Like, that's the thesis that you need to work on, because I think what we often do is we get to the thing without tying it back to what the market needs. So spend some time there, be like, why is this the answer to their problem? And what makes this different than what they've tried and failed with before?
Nice. And I think if they want to stick with something, is that like answering those questions and trying to not do it overnight, but truly deep dive into it and find the answer and iterate, right? Because at the end of the day, I probably assume that most of these people that we look up to and they came up with these amazing ownable ideas was years of iteration, years of researching or understanding and talking to their customers.
And so the reality is, though, too, that the idea that I've seen people that are really, really smart say things that are really smart that don't get the attention that they potentially deserve. And it's sometimes because there's something to be said around the messenger effect, right? We trust a message coming from a specific person more so than we might trust it coming from somebody else. And so part of this too is looking at yourself and going, well, where do I have the most credibility, right? Because when I started talking about buyer psychology, I hadn't worked in behavioral economics. I wasn't somebody who had a lot of credibility in that space. What I did have was a deep background in marketing and a lot of curiosity around how this could all be applied to marketing. And so my background as a marketer, having led a branding agency, that gave me some credibility there to speak about this. I think for a lot of folks, it's like figuring out, like, where does your expertise lie and how can you kind of leverage that more? And that makes a lot of difference.
Yes, indeed. And that's what I love about the project you have, because you could came in this podcast and share, here's the framework that I use, these are the steps, go and apply it. But it needs work and it needs your expertise, your story, and truly understanding your market at the end of the day. And for those that are here until this point and they're like, all right, this is the time to invest in myself and truly find my ownable idea, where they can find you?
So they can find me at ownableideas.com. You'll land on the sign up page for my newsletter, which is beunignorable.com. Or beunignorable.com is, you can also get it there. But ultimately right now, I'm not working with any clients. I have a current batch of clients I'm working with. Then I'm going to take several months off. I've got a few priorities that I want to build in the business, some back end stuff to make the work better, to make it easier to fulfill and the experience really delightful for the client. But come September, I might be taking on more clients. But the newsletter is the best way to see a breakdown of this. It'll show you kind of the ways different people are approaching it, what their ideas are, how they got them out there, what the kind of psychology is behind why it worked. And so the newsletter is the best way to kind of follow along with the work, or just follow me on LinkedIn. I'm spending some more time on Substack now too. I like Substack Notes. It reminds me of the early days of Twitter, which I miss very much. So you also find me on Substack. I'm just starting there, so I have a tiny audience, but I'm liking the vibes. I think a lot more people should spend some time there.
Yeah, speaking of good old times of Twitter, that's how I actually stumbled upon your work. I think it was a couple of years ago. And I'll put all the links down below so you can find Katelyn all over and follow her work. And as a closing thought, I would like to tell those tuning in until this moment what we can do in 1 week in order to start working on their ownable idea.
I'd say what you can do in 1 week is make a list of stuff that pisses you off about your industry, the world that you work in. And oftentimes in those frustrations lies the answer to kind of the way that you're thinking differently. So when I think about it from my own perspective, when I was working on the Unignorable Challenge, and I was most of the work I was doing was in the personal brand space then, I made this list of the things that I just patently disagreed with, that I saw other people promoting. There were so many people that were focused on like impressions and talking about the speed of like audience growth. And then I'd look at their content and I'd be like, this is bullshit. This content is as broad as can be. They're building an audience of a bunch of people who won't actually think of them for one specific thing that's going to benefit their business long term. And so they're giving the advice of how to build an audience to entrepreneurs who aren't people who are experts on how to build an audience. And so they're like, the techniques won't apply to them. And so I'd say make that list of the things that piss you off, and then dig into why. Why is this advice bad? Why is this advice problematic? What happens when people follow this advice? Because there's always something there. Those are where the insights might lie. And for me, what I looked at and like how I came to ownable ideas as my ownable idea, I know it's so meta, is that I was thinking about I want to continue doing work with the Unignorable. I don't want to keep running it the way I had before. But I looked at the program and I was like, when I look at the people who had breakthrough success, when I look at the people who are the most dominant kind of like thought leaders in the business world, all of them have this one thing, which is like they become known for this one thing first. So they've got like this big breakthrough moment. And if I could help people to just figure out the breakthrough moment, then would that get them to like the 80-20? Like there's so many good tactics out there, but if you don't actually have the right story underneath, that if you don't actually have the right narrative that you're sharing with your audience, something that really is compelling that they can buy into, the tactical stuff isn't as effective. So if I just spend time there, that generate a lot more value than all of the other tactical stuff I see everybody else talking about in personal branding. And my hypothesis was yes. And so I'm testing that hypothesis out now with what we're doing. So I'd say think about what you are doing differently, what pisses you off, what you see that makes your eyes roll, what frustrates you because you think it's bad advice that actually leads people astray. That's where the nuggets and the kind of seeds are for what could grow into your ownable idea.
And this is a perfect example of why you should stick to the end of a podcast episode, because what Katelyn just shared is basically the foundation of your future brand or of your future business. And if you do the work, you'll get there. And don't forget to follow Katelyn Bourgoin work, LinkedIn, her newsletter, and you'll find there the nuggets that will lead you there.
Thank you so much, Gabe.
Thank you so much, Katelyn, for joining me today. And thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, for sticking to the end. And if this conversation made you think differently about marketing, about building a business around an idea and not the traditional way of doing a personal brand, you know what to do. Follow Katelyn, subscribe to the podcast, and until next week, pura vida.